Hi, want to learn how to draw this? If so, you definitely come to the right place. A lot of people struggle with drawing eyes, and understandably so. They're such a complex part of the human body, and if you want to draw them realistically, it can become quite the task. So today I'm going to be telling you all the things that I did to draw this eye, and I don't want to drag on the intro too long, so let's get started. So, into the sketch. One thing I want to mention is that I have my reference linked down in the description and a few other good ones for practice as well. So I didn't film too much of the sketch, but essentially what I did was draw the top curve the best that I could to see how the picture had it, draw the shape of the iris, and then draw the bottom curve, and then add in some eyelids and that weird pink thing that you rub when your eyes are itchy. Yeah, that thing. And there's really no method to this. I just tried to copy the picture as best as I could. But some things that may help you is to take your reference and pop into a drawing software and simplify it down into shapes, and then you can just draw those shapes. That way you don't get confused because of the many different colors and shadings that may trick your eye into thinking the shapes are something else. I didn't do this, so it doesn't look too accurate, but I still think the result looks fine. Or like I said, you can always do what I did and simply just draw on the shape. I also try to draw on the details as well, so that way I know where to place the lights and the darks, including the light parts of the eye that look like, I actually don't know what they look like. It literally just looks so random. But anyways, moving on. I'll also leave some tips in the description. And yeah, let's move on to the white part of the eye. I tend to choose the most simple part of the eye first, just so that I can get a feel for the actual drawing. And that would be the white of the eye. It's the least complex in my opinion. So, as you probably already know, whites of the eyes are usually not completely white. They are often gray with a tint of pink. Sometimes blue, it really depends on the reference you're working from, but typically around the top and the bottom, it's more saturated in color. And usually around the iris or the colored part of the eye, it sort of looks like a dark ring around the iris, and is typically just a more desaturated and lighter version of the iris color. However, in my reference, that wasn't shown too much, so I just blended out the black with a hint of blue, and around that I put some pink. And although it just looks like a few minutes, this part actually took me 30 minutes because I wanted to get it as smooth as I could. Basically, yes, as you can tell, my priority was to get it as smooth as possible so that way it would look really good. Now for the top part of the eye, which looks like the waterline except upside down. I don't actually know what it's called. If you happen to be my cousin who's an eye doctor, please correct me because I have no clue what I'm talking about. Anyways, yes, this part may look a little bit lighter in your reference, but the truth is that it's in shadow, so it's going to be a bit darker, so that's why I made it a little bit darker than I thought I needed to, and turned out really good in my opinion. Basically for this, I don't like to blend out with whites because it's so dark, so instead I tend to go with a peachy color to blend it out, just so it's not too noticeable. Again, you'll want to layer really lightly at first and then slowly build up, just like we did for the whites. Now for that weird pink thing that I was talking about earlier. Typically, it'll look a lot bumpier and have more highlights than this. So if your reference have highlights, go ahead and put those in, or you can do those later, I don't really care. And as you can see, and this will happen all throughout the entire drawing, I look at the part of the reference that I'm drawing, ask myself if it looks more saturated or desaturated, and then just go from there. Typically, if I want the colors to stand out, I'll start with the most saturated color, and then work in with my grays or my complementaries to tone it down. And if I want it to look more gray than anything, I'll just go in with a gray first, and then work in with my colors. This helps you from going overboard with either too much neutrals or too many bright colors. I don't know, just something I thought I'd share. And then doing the actual waterline, which I decided to go with the same colors except lighter. And towards the more shaded area on the right, I noticed it was a bit more cool tones, so then I went in with some more purpley pinks. Again, as I stated, there's really no method to these three parts, because honestly, your main goal is to get it looking smooth and the values and your colors to look relatively accurate. But don't worry, I'll be going into more detail when it comes to the iris and the skin. Alright, so here's just something to tell you. Usually waterlines are not really super bright pink, they usually have some gray in them, or are a duller orange. Again, same method, you will want to layer in your pinks, purples, or oranges, or anything that you see in your reference. Go in with a gray, brown, or any other neutral to tone it down, and then use a white to blend it out. This method can be reapplied to almost anything you want to draw. And as you're working, you work on this other side of the white of the eye. In most references, you'll often notice that one side of the whites of the eye is often darker than the other side. It's all dependent in your light source, and in my case, the light source is coming from the left, explaining why on most of the picture, the left side is a lot brighter than the white. And it also explains why I put most of the cooler tones on the left side of the drawing as opposed to on the right side. Alright, moving on. Alright, so generally when you're looking around and you take a picture of your eye, the iris will not be in the exact center, meaning that the pupil might not be in the exact center as well. In some pictures that is the case, but in a lot of them that is not the case, so don't make that mistake. Make sure you are layering your blacks over your blues or oranges or whatever tones you see under the black. Most of the time, pupils will be very dark with maybe a subtle highlight, but it's usually not too noticeable. And as you can see from the left to the right of the pupil, I put a blue gradient to a black gradient. The reason why it appears blue on one side is because, again, of the light source and the fact that there is a highlight directly next to it. However, this may vary. Again, I mean, I've said this a million times, but make sure to refer to your reference. Alright, here comes the part that most of you are probably here for, the iris. And let me tell you something that completely changed how I drew irises. Your main goal is to preserve the parts of the eye that stands out to you the most. And to elaborate on this, basically the iris is not just one color. It's filled with many different swirls and ribbon-like structures, colors that look like they're folding into each other. And my main trick is, when you look at an iris, check the first thing that pops out to you, because what stands out to you first will likely be the thing that people mark as important when they look at the photo, and also the thing that stands out. The way I apply this, in this photo specifically, are the various light areas in the eye, starting with the one that you see me drawing in the video. So essentially what I'm trying to say here is you want to start off by illustrating the things that you notice first, as opposed to doing the things that you notice last, because that'll just make things harder for yourself. The one thing I would say this does not apply to is bright white highlights found at the bottom of the iris or the top in really dark areas, because if you have a Posca pen, jelly roll, or anything like that, you can go layer that in top and make a much cleaner line than if you just went around it. The other thing for this is to go in with the areas where it's just a flat color, and basically this is just my way of putting off things that I know will be hard. Anyways, with that aside, and having that out there for you to know, let's talk about what structures in the eye you need to pay attention to when it comes to specifically the iris. In most incredibly detailed photos of eyes, with lots of contrast, which is the kind of photo that you will be looking for when it comes to choosing a reference, the detail is very clear, and generally, I'm not saying this is for all eyes because eyes are all very different and they can vary a lot, but there's usually a dark ring around the iris, which of course will vary in darkness from eye to eye. A sort of wavy area around the pupil that tends to be darker than the rest of the iris. Some randomized shapes that are lighter in color than the rest of the iris that extend from the darker area surrounding the pupil and outwards. And quite obviously, this doesn't really belong to the iris itself, but it is an important part, and that is highlights. Now that we've gone through all of those parts, let's go through how I apply all these to the actual drawing itself. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I like to work from least complicated to most complicated, so that way I sort of get a feel for the drawing at first. And one of the things I like to do first, because it also stands out to me the most, is a highlight. So I think this is obvious, but highlights are not usually completely white unless they are. But in most cases, highlights will display some sort of color or some sort of reflection from the outside world or eyelashes. If you see any of those things in your reference, be sure to put them in the drawing. It just looks better than if you just did a bright white highlight, because if it's a bright white highlight, then it just looks like you forgot to color in a part of the drawing. There's really not much I can say for highlights other than just layer lightly and be patient. Alright, so parts of the eye that are smoother, you may notice that there are some lighter splotches and some darker splotches, which again should stand out to you. For irises specifically, which tend to be more colorful if you're looking on a photo from online, again, I tend to go in with my dark colors and then layer on some bright colors and then layer on some grays, just to tone it down a bit. There's honestly really no method to this. Just honestly try to fill in the dark parts of the eye and the light parts of the eye the best that you can, and of course add in the midtones between them. While some parts of the eye are smooth, I want you to also pay attention to the parts that look like they're hard edge, which specifically shows up around the light parts of the eye that I told you about. Key is honestly variation. If you have variation in your eye, it'll look more interesting. So you might be asking, how do you get a hard edge? Well, basically, like I said, if you did the light parts of the eye first, you can then use a darker color to go over the edges of the light color, and then make a clean edge. Now in my drawing specifically, the left side of the eye is clearly softer, especially when compared to the right side. Whatever you do, just make sure you're doing the details that stand out to you first, and then doing the smaller details later. And I just want to emphasize that this is not a fast process. What you're seeing here is only a few minutes of drawing, but this eye actually took me around 16 hours, which is pretty long, and it took me long enough so that way I kind of don't have anything else to say about the iris anymore, so enjoy the sped up portion of the video and I'll meet you back later with the skin. Alright, so I'm back and I'm finishing up my last detail, including taking my white color pencil and running it across the dark areas to sort of give it some more detail, taking my Pit Artist pen and creating some highlights, and now we're working on the skin. Okay, so since the skin in my photo is more desaturated, meaning it looks more gray, I went in with the gray first and then layered in some peaches, layering some darker patches over others. And it's important that you do this because skin is very bumpy when it's taken a picture of up close, but since the skin might have moved a bit, it appears to be a little bit blurrier, which means that in some areas, pores and the bumpiness of the skin may not be as clear or distinct. However, as I've already said multiple times, this will vary from drawing to drawing. So this is basically just a process layering in some grays and peaches, and then going in with your whites to create patches of light on top of the areas that are lighter. And of course, they should be random because if they look too uniform, then it won't look realistic. Varying in saturation. Essentially, the main aspects of the skin are patches of light areas that appear a little bit more gray, patches of deeper areas that appear a little bit more saturated, and areas of highlight. Now this is the part that I'd really recommend that you get some sort of highlight. I seriously recommend the Pit Artist pen because it specifically layers varying from light to dark, and you can even go over with your colored pencils with a light wash if you feel that you went too dark. So if you're able to get one, I highly recommend that you do. It's really worth it. Also, you'll want to create some sort of stripes because you have to remember that this is a 3D form and we're going to be adding eyelashes later, and the eyelashes are going to cast a shadow on the skin as well. However, don't make this too dark, only make it a little bit subtle. Note that skin behaves differently in different lighting settings. Specifically in my drawing, the right portion of the skin is a lot darker because of the light source coming from the left. So on the left you may see darker splotches along with darker highlights. Just keep that in mind and just continue this process of layering up splotches of darker color and splotches of lighter color, transitioning into the waterline as well. One of the biggest things to remember is that highlights on the lighter parts of the skin that are not cast in shadow tend to be very close to white, and highlights on darker portions of skin tend to be closer to the shadows of the part that was... Okay, I don't know if I'm making any sense, but you get it. And just continue this process. Again, I'm going to speed up the video so that way you can see how the process is done really quickly. Alright, so if you made it this far, I'm really proud of you. Next portion I'll be talking about is the eyelashes. Now, since the eyelashes on the top are usually thicker and covered in mascara for the photo shoot, you'll want to draw out the biggest ones first. You won't need to do this with smaller lashes, but it's important to include the eyelashes in your sketch, or at least the ones that are larger. In general, eyelashes tend to be a bit blurry because they move a little bit. So how I go about this process is draw out the eyelashes fanning out from the eye, color them in very lightly, concentrating the pigment at the middle of the eyelashes, and then draw the skin, blending it out. Note that skin tends to be a little bit less detailed on the eyelid because it's a little bit blurrier because eyelids tend to move a lot more. Remember that below the eyelid it should be in shadow so that way it looks like the upper fold of the skin is above that. And remember that your eyelashes usually should fan out in the same direction as from the middle of the eye. Also, one mistake I commonly see, please don't put the eyelashes on the actual eyeball. Your eyelashes grow from your skin, so this is just something I want you to keep in mind. Again, make sure you're using the same methods that I use throughout this process. Unless something works better for you, then go ahead and do that. Again, I've covered pretty much everything I wanted to say, so you know the drill. At this stage, you should be pretty much done adding finishing touches, like the lower lashes, which should be fanning out as well. Since you sort of have only one go at this, it'll be a bit difficult, but essentially you want to make sure that your pencil is sharp, that you are doing it in sort of a flicking curve motion, and that you're going sort of lightly so that way it doesn't look super dark. This is the stage to go ahead and fix up everything that you don't like, add in extra details, and overall make the piece something you're proud of. And I hope this was useful for you. If you want to see a Crayola tutorial for portraits, let me know. And with that, I'll see you.